In this video, we're looking at the concept and the theory of supply-side economics. This is a very important theory in economics that has been the subject of research and policies, of mental policies at all levels of governance. So let's take a look at this concept and begin to understand what it is, right? So again, we're looking at supply-side economics, and you've often heard the term supply-side economics, but not really knowing what it entails. All right, so let's take a look at this closely. So it says here, supply-side economics is a macro, right, theory. So again, let's take note of this point here. Macro theory means big, right? Macro, and economics is big, right? And the micro is small, right? And why is this important? Because this looks at the wider picture. This looks at economics from a global perspective. That's why it's important to understand the difference between macro and micro. So macroeconomics theory, and this theory states that economic growth, which is very key, and every country looks for economic growth because it's important for stability, important for sustainability, it's important to maintain an active workforce. So this theory then states that economic growth is most achieved when taxes are lowered. When taxes are lowered, a lot of things can happen. These are taxes, right? Taxes are lowered, a lot of things happen. People have more money, right, in their pockets. More money in their pockets. And if they have more money in their pockets, well, what happens? They go shopping, right? They consume. This is consume. They consume products. They invest products. They invest in the economy. They buy houses, they buy cars, they buy appliances, and so forth, etc. That's why lower taxes are very critical in terms of economic growth. Let's take a look at this again closely. Supply-side economics is a macroeconomic theory that states that economic growth is most achieved when taxes are lower and then stringent economic regulations are reduced as well. So two things are happening here. One is taxes, which is lowered, and regulations are reduced. So what are regulations, right? So every country has regulations for companies, and those regulations sometimes could be very tight on these companies, making it difficult for them to operate and be profitable. And some of them may leave the country, some of them may just close up, etc. So reducing economic regulations, right, and allowing free trade. So when regulations are reduced, free trade thrives. Right? Free trade thrives. That's important as well because, again, free trade means money. It means foreign exchange. It means hard currency. In some cases, it means capacity, right? So free trade is good. So, but economic regulations actually, right, impact free trade in a very negative way because they put all kinds of restrictions in place. And sometimes there are higher taxes for companies. And sometimes companies are not able to meet the regulations that are put in place, or they're struggling to meet the regulations that are put in place, right? So microeconomic theory then says that economic growth is most achieved when taxes are lower and economic regulations are reduced to the barest minimum to allow companies to thrive, to allow businesses to thrive, to allow more businesses to come into that space, into the country, etc. This is very important, and this is the crux of this theory, the supply-side theory, that suggests that when taxes are lower and economic regulations are reduced, that allows for free trade. And if we are talking about free trade, then we're talking about employment. We're talking about capital coming to that country. We're talking about capacity in that space and a host of other things. All right, so let's continue. According to this theory, right, greater supply of goods and services at lower prices will benefit consumers. Now, this is also a very important point. In what way will it benefit consumers? Why are lower prices good for consumers? Because they pay less, They have more money in their pockets and they can extend and expand reach of the money to other things. This is good. And then, of course, you have happy consumers, and happy consumers are return consumers, right? They come back and back and back. They come back to purchase the goods, and they continue to patronize the economy. So, according to this theory, greater supply of goods and services at lower prices will benefit the consumer, and it will lead to an increase in employment as well. It benefits the consumer. Employment goes high because there's money in the economy. Companies are able to hire, they're able to pay workers and so forth, benefits, salaries, and what have you, right? So it increases employment. And if we have free trade in that space, well, that also means employment. You have less regulations in the economy for companies. It means companies are coming into that space and they are hiring. That means higher employment, etc. That's the connection, the interconnectedness of all of this is very key to understanding this theory of microeconomics, supply side economics. Supply side fiscal policies foster increase in aggregate supply, right? So foster means, of course, encouraging increase in aggregate supply of goods and services as opposed to aggregate demand. Now, this is very important. Aggregate supply, the collective supply within that economy is aggregate supply, what is supplied in a given period of time by companies, manufacturers, and so forth, even government and so forth, is aggregate supply as opposed to aggregate demand, which is the opposite, what is being demanded in that space by the consumers. And aggregate supply then increases output and employment while lowering prices, right? By lowering prices. So aggregate supply, when you have aggregate supply, it leads to employment, it leads to lowering prices because again there is a lot of goods in the system, and if there's a lot of goods in the system, well then the competition is high, and that leads to lowering prices. And of course, if there are again a lot of goods in the system, you are hiring people to move those goods. That's how employment gets impacted in a very positive way. That is supply side economics. Understanding its core in terms of the factors that are involved here. Economic growth is achieved by lower taxes and, of course, reduced economic regulations. And that leads to free trade. Again, this is a very important point. Free trade means capacity, means capital, means foreign exchange, and means personal expertise, and so forth. And according to this theory, once again, greater supply of goods and services at lower prices will benefit consumers, benefit them because they have more money in their pockets, they're paying less for goods, and it will lead to an increase in employment because, of course, there's money in their pockets, businesses are hiring, businesses have money to spend. Supply side fiscal policies foster increase in aggregate supply. We just talked about that. Aggregate supply in terms of the collective supply within that space over a period of time, as opposed to aggregate demand. And this increases, this being the supply, aggregate supply increases output and employment while lowering prices. This is supply side economics.